Awesome. All right. So you got any big plans today or?
Today, no, this is my big plan, but I'm also working on promoting a workshop that I'm hosting next Friday. So once y'all leave, I'll probably create a little content to get that on people's radar.
Are you doing that on Instagram or?
Yeah, most of my following's on Instagram, and I just started a Substack like fairly recently. I sent you a few of the
that's
articles.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I felt like really cool when you sent me that, by the way.
Yeah, good. I'm so glad. Well, because a lot of my content was becoming long format on a platform that's not built for that, Instagram, and so but I had built up a community there that I love, and so I'm continuing to make content there and get the word out. But the tricky part is Instagram is such a global community, and I am holding a very local event. So I'm just trying to really make an effort this next year to get more involved locally and make an impact on soils like here, right here.
It's very powerful. I listened to Chris Best. I think that's his name, the owner of Substack. Or the creator of Substack?
Yeah, I was like, why does that sound familiar?
Yeah, he's a very interesting character.
Yeah, that's
like
cool.
He's really innovative, believes in like free speech and creativity and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So he's really awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah, they stand out in terms of like really empowering their users to own their own platform, because we don't own these algorithms and stuff that social media uses, and so it's been a really useful tool for me to just find people that are like your biggest fans are going to be the ones following your newsletter there.
And they're getting into podcasting too. Have you thought about that venture at all?
I have thought about that. In fact, you might need to give me some tips on like a good starter microphone. And yeah, because I tried recording. I just like basically vocalizing my last newsletter. I was just testing it out with the podcast feature on my AirPods, and it sounded like garbage. So
your content on Substack's amazing. You'd be amazing at reading your material and being able to add little nuances that you can't really add while you're writing. People would really, I think, would flock to that information.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah. So what is your career like? What are you officially titled?
What do I do? Yeah. I've actually really struggled with knowing what my title is because I kind of am the one to create it as an entrepreneur or self-employed person. And so what's resonating with me the most that I think captures what I actually do day to day is a soil restoration practitioner. So sometimes I hesitate around the word expert, and I have people that are like, no, like you're definitely an expert in this. Like you should call yourself an expert. But there's just so much knowledge out there. And I feel like practitioner really captures like my ever evolving understanding of soils, different types of soils, and my understanding of how to restore them. So that I would say if there's a title, that would be it.
What is your education in? I called you like when people were asking me, hey, who are you going to go talk to? I was like, well, she's a soil biologist. And I was like, not really it, but like, what did you get your degree in?
So my degree is a mouthful. It's called Bioenvironmental Science. And I did that at Texas A&M University in College Station. I noticed you had a 979 number. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Dripping Springs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I work at Dow Chemical out there for my real job. So
cool. I was going to ask you about that. So went there for a degree that, in hindsight, that degree was being marketed to students as a way to the green industry. So I went to school between like 2009, 2013, and they were really trying to capture students that were interested in sustainability and in careers in sustainability. But I really think now, as time goes on, looking back, it was one of the first times the university was trying to provide what I would call an interdisciplinary approach to an agriculture degree, because the program was under Agriculture and Life Sciences College. And so I would have like a plant pathology class and then a hydrology class and a biofuels class, like all in the same schedule. And so it was kind of all over the place, and which made it was interesting, but it actually wasn't very integrated. So by that, I mean, like I had a soil microbiology class, which is what sparked my interest in what I do today. But I also had very conventional soil classes, and we weren't talking about how the chemical usage and the herbicide usage was killing the soil biology. We weren't connecting those dots in either one of those classes. And so that took me years out of college and real life experience to really understand.
Very nice. I'm curious. How did you focus? Like, what intrigued you about soil and wanted to dive in and strictly focus on the subject?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't sound like a very interesting subject until you learn. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
So I'm very much just barely scratching the surface on stuff that you send me and watching informational podcasts and stuff like that.
Cool.
So, but how did you like say, I want to do this?
Yeah. I mean, I was just like you know, probably 12 years ago, like, what's the significance of soil? Why am I taking these classes? I don't see how it's relevant to me. And once I started learning all of the services that soil provides naturally to humanity, we can get into a few examples of those.
Oh, yeah.
It really opened up my mind to what kind of magic is actually happening below our feet, and we just don't even realize it. So, yeah, I would say to the uninitiated, the first thing you need to know is that soil systems are a really magical natural resource. They're very vibrant, interesting living ecosystems, but I think people don't find themselves, they're not interesting to look at with the naked eye, right? So like when we just like look at the ground, it's not that interesting, and so it doesn't spark awe like if you were looking at a starry night sky. But once you get a microscope and you start looking at all of the life that's actually occurring there, that's what creates the awe and wonder. So I'd say that's kind of that experience of seeing what was actually going on in the soil is what sparked my initial curiosity, and then actually growing food for the first time and composting, like those experiences really fortified my direction in life.
Have you heard of that yoga guru, Sadhguru?
Yeah, Sadhguru.
Sadhguru,
Yeah.
okay. I've watched a few of his YouTube videos, and the first time I really listened to him was on Joe Rogan, and he went on and explained how important soil was. And this was what kind of got my interest, and because I never heard it explained, like we are soil, like human beings are made from soil. Everything we depend on is made from soil. Yeah. And the degradation of what we're doing to our soil is really, like, if you just drown yourself in that information for a couple of days, it's actually really scary.
Right.
So are we at a point of no return in our soil? Or how do we get here, and how do we get it better, I guess?
Yeah, that's the big question, huh? I wouldn't say I'm an optimist when it comes to this stuff. I have a lot of hope, because here's the thing. We are a species on this planet that's consciously aware of our impact on our environment and how that in turn impacts us, right? So the fact that we have that awareness means we can do something about it if we realize, which is that we're having like this great awakening of understanding what we're doing to soil systems and how it's impacting us. And so that's the first step, is awareness. And then the next step is just stopping the detrimental sources of the impact and restoring and providing different solutions, trying something new instead of just doing the same old thing that's harming us.
What's the number one thing that's killing our soil?
The number one thing, I think it's a lack of awareness. It would be like the large umbrella that I put, because whether you're a farmer or a homeowner, when you interact with your soil system and you're not aware of it being an ecosystem, you have a tendency to put products on it that kills a lot of that life in the soil. And that's where all of our problems start, is when we kill the soil organisms. Or even if we knowingly, there's excavation happening all around me right now. This is a new neighborhood. And it doesn't take a scientist to say, well, we're like disturbing that soil ecosystem. Like they're carting off huge truckloads of soil. And if we can at least have the awareness that, like, okay, we're disturbing this, we know that, but what are we going to do to try to then reintroduce life to the soil systems in these disturbed landscapes?
So everything that we do in farming is basically backwards. Like I thought like you needed to till the land and
Right.
shake up the dirt a little bit and pesticides to keep the insects off and herbicides to help, but all that's really not good for crops and the land itself. So how did we get to the point there? Yeah, how did we get there?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, these are really human things to try, okay? Because we want control, and the way our brains work is we think in short-term observations, right? And soil fertility loss is a long-term problem. It can actually show pretty quick effects, whether you're improving the soil or harming it. It can show effects, but if you're not aware of what the source of the problem is, you just keep throwing stuff at it, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. So then you just keep saying like, okay, well, we've been tilling these fields, like let's say early colonization time in the Americas, when we had great fertile soils from the prairies that were being managed by indigenous practices. Once that was disturbed and we started tilling up the land, the plants did great initially, but it was like kind of this slow burn. And I was like, okay, well, now we need fertilizer because there's no nutrient cycling happening here. We destroyed the ecosystem that provides nutrients to plants. And so then you start putting fertilizer on, and then you start having pest issues. So you're like, okay, well, now we need to deal with the pests. And then there's this whole industry around, and like once profitability gets in there and the economics of providing solutions for these problems that we created, it's like the engine just gets going. And so I don't think it's been a very conscious thing that we've done. Like we haven't known that we've been doing the wrong thing until like recent history. And so that this field of soil ecology and soil biology, the research that we have and the knowledge that we're gaining is relatively new.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it possible for a farmland to re-heal itself, and what are some ways that if it's been heavily farmed or heavily cropped, the traditional American way, is it possible to regenerate that, and what are some ways to do that?
Definitely. So you think about, what does nature do? Number one, the biggest thing is that we've again disturbed the ecosystem. And when I say that, I mean like the actual life that exists in the soil that's responsible for building good soil structure, the kind of structure that infiltrates water, cleans water, which makes our landscapes drought tolerant and even mitigate fire or minimize fire disruption. That kind of activity is disturbed when we put a lot of these pesticides and herbicides. The just as a side note, like aside, ICID like means to kill. So like, oh wow. So like it's killing herbs, killing pests, but it's also killing our soil biology. In the soil, we're losing a lot of that life, and that brings me back to like the first step is reinoculating the land with beneficial biology, the biology that natively was there, but we disturbed it to the best of our ability, and getting those microorganisms back in association with plants. And it can be a cultivated crop. We don't have to necessarily convert all of our landscapes, our agriculture landscapes, back to native vegetation, because we got a world to feed. But if you can take notes from nature of how all plants evolved with biological partners in the underground. Right. And so reintroducing those relationships is the first way to start regenerating the land. Can you talk about some of those relationships, and what do you mean when there's the life in the land, like the life in the soil? What are you talking about there? Okay, so I'm literally talking about nematodes, which are little worms. They're kind of more of a charismatic character that we see on the microscope because they're a larger organism compared to bacteria, which would be a whole other category. Fungi, which, by the way, you can say fungi. So you can say it differently. Yeah, ways. You can totally say it differently. I always try to share that because I just had a professor that really drilled it into me that she wanted us to say it a certain way, fungi, but you can say it however. That's like what in Texas was like pecan. Yeah. Just pick your flavor and stick to it. So, yeah, fungi is a really important category that almost all of the soils I look at, whether it came from a rural area or an urban site, is deficient in fungi because it's more sensitive to our type of disturbances. So whether that's compaction or tilling, they're usually the first ones to be responding to that. Another group is called Protozoa. So these are things that eat bacteria. And that's really important because every time a protozoa, an example of a protozoa is an amoeba. So a lot of people kind of have an image of what an amoeba might be.
And it's like a negative connotation a little bit. Right?
Yeah, sometimes it's like, oh, a brain-eating amoeba.
Yeah,
like,
it's the first thing that popped in my head.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that kind of goes to show, like, we have a lot of connotations around bacteria, too. And there are good bacteria and bad bacteria, detrimental bacteria, beneficial bacteria. And same with fungi. Like, there are things that attack plants, and then there's those that have evolved to work with plants. And sometimes there's a microorganism that naturally would help a plant out, but if we have disrupted that relationship so much, it could turn and then become like a problematic. And sometimes this happens like in our guts too. Like if a gut microorganism, if you have like leaky gut syndrome, then it can cause problems like on the other parts of your body. So it's similar in the soil where you have you need a balance of these organism groups: bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and then you kind of get into more of your macro stuff like mites and different kind of insects.
So when a neighborhood like this or any other neighborhood pops up, it obviously that land gets disturbed, and then we bring in like dirt and like this fake grass.
Right.
Does that naturally over time heal itself? Like, because me and my buddy were just talking about this. Like he can't grow his grass right. And it's a fairly new neighborhood.
Right.
And I'm like, this is like fake grass. Like it makes, I didn't know how to articulate very well, but it makes sense. Like this is like a fake thing. Like, does it ever naturally, does it fix itself or is it just?
I mean, and you can see my lawn too, by the way. This is a very much like cobbler's kids have no shoes situation where I'm, I have all this brand new synthetic turf and I don't have the patience to water something that's not going to be drought tolerant. So like whatever died this summer. And I will slowly try to restore it and keep some of that turf because it does support an ecosystem below ground. So to answer your question, yes, it would naturally go through what I would call ecological succession, but on a geological time scale. Okay, so it's not something that we would see in our lifetime, especially our time that we spend in our homes, 5-10 years sometimes. You wouldn't expect to see a huge improvement in your lawn, but if you came back 100 years from now, like it could look like a totally different landscape.
Yeah, my dad always makes jokes. My dad likes to plant like trees and fruit trees, and he's always like, "Well, I won't be around to see these." Like, that's a harsh joke to make.
I know, right?
A little too real for me.
But good for him. He's leaving a legacy. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another thing that piques my interest is this talk of not being able to fully provide nutritious food because we've like killed the soil so much.
Right.
Can you talk about that? Is that a real thing? And is there a true like fear of not being able to provide enough food like in the future because of this?
Yeah. Those are. I'm going to tackle those as two separate questions because the first one is more about nutrient density, like the quality of our food. And there are plenty of studies showing that the quality of our food, the nutrient density of our food today is much less than it once was before these conventional chemical-based approach to farming. And so the reason for that, thinking like a biologist, is that when plants have evolved with their microbial partners to get the nutrients that they need to be the healthiest plant they can be, and we disrupt that, then we're really just relying on us, like as farmers or land stewards, to meet the needs of that plant and feeding it these synthetic nutrients. And that's a lot of pressure. Like we didn't evolve with the plants over that amount of time like the microbes did. So we end up feeding a plant and making it look normal, but it doesn't necessarily have all the nutrient density that it would if it was in relationship with the fungi and bacteria that it evolved with.
I'm curious, listening to you talk, and your position and how you're wanting to help the world. Do you ever get any type of negative feedback from like the food industry that's growing, these big crops of field? Like, are you trying to like fight that system? Do
Right.
do you ever get attacked from those type of people because you're in a way treading on what they're doing, right?
Totally. I think so. My feelings on these big ag producers isn't all that negative, actually. I think they fell into a habit and a system that wasn't their intention. And what I mean by that is like the way our policies work and the way our government works to incentivize certain practices over others, that's created a circumstance where some people feel they have no choice, and they really don't in some cases. I mean, it's that or walk away from your whole family history, or go bankrupt, So I find anything personally wrong with people who are part of this system, of the big food system. But I also don't try to reach out to them to convince them otherwise to like go regenerative. I'm mostly am working with people who are already at that point.
Right.
And I provide content, and who knows, like maybe somebody reads something and it gets their wheels turning and it sets the stage for them to be ready for that. That would be a great thing. I'd love to hear that. But that's not my main mission. My main mission is just meeting people where they're at. So if that means they're like kind of curious, but they're scared, understandably so, to try something different, that's where I'm ready to like meet them where they are and make some changes.
It's such a large industry, the food industry, and there's so much behind it, and it gets almost like a political discussion when you start talking about eating like an animal-based diet or plants. It gets it's a very tribal discussion.
Yes.
So personally, what do you consume like on a daily basis? Knowing what what kind of thoughts and decisions do you make when it comes to eating?
Yeah. I mean, my journey's evolved quite a bit over time too, but today I try my best to only eat regenerative meat, and I'm not perfect. I mean, sometimes I will stop at a Whataburger and people are going to hate me for that, but I'm just being transparent, I do my best to all the meat that we make for ourselves. We're really trying to find producers that make regenerative meat, and so our friend Taylor Collins at Rome Ranch, they're a regenerative bison ranch in Fredericksburg, and he's also a co-founder of a brand called Force of Nature. And so I just want to plug them real quick because they've been transformative to people like me who want to eat meat that's from a regenerative source, but how do you find it? It's really hard. You can go to your farmer's market, and even then it's not regenerative. I mean, it's not necessarily like, the consolidated feedlots, like some of the stuff at the grocery store, but it's still not regenerative a lot of the time. And so they've made it so easy. They're basically a distributor, and they have all these small regenerative producers that, whether it's boar meat or venison or bison or grass-fed beef, they've consolidated that under one brand and distribute it across the country, so you can get it almost anywhere.
Is it really possible to supply food to the entire country or to the entire world via the regenerative way?
Oh yeah, I think it's more promising. So, and people will argue with me about that. I also kind of fluff feathers when I say that, like, I have a yes and approach to my philosophy on providing food to the world. And what I mean by that is I do have a background in working with more controlled ag, people. So controlled ag would include people growing in greenhouses, growing hydroponically, growing indoors, vertical farms, that kind of thing. And those systems aren't soil based. So a lot of times that throws people off. They're like, why are you okay with that? Number one, we're already farming that way, that controlled way in our fields, and it's not good. If you're going to farm that way, you're treating the soil as a substrate and nothing else. You're not actually regenerating it. So the soil is not providing any of these other ecosystem services outside of like holding roots. It's not providing that kind of like water infiltration and the drought tolerance I was talking about before. And again, I want to definitely get into the long list of all the services that soil can provide. But so if we can bring some of that cultivation indoors and do it the same way, but do it indoors and do it in a much smaller footprint in these like vertical farms, hell yes, let's do that. Because it's not that the food, it would also actually be a lot cleaner in some ways. So you wouldn't have as many pests and herbicides because you're not fighting all of these weeds and stuff. So in some ways, like if I go to the grocery store and I have the option to get lettuce from a really conventional producer that's raised in the field, or a hydroponic lettuce, or an organic local lettuce, and there's never a regenerative option, right? For a lot of this stuff. So I'm not even going to put it on the list. I mean, if it was there, that'd be my number one choice. But I think I would actually go with the hydroponic lettuce first, the organic one second, and then the conventional third. That's
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's the lettuce that's grown hydroponically or grown organically in a field, they still use pesticides and things. It's certified organic, but I still don't want that stuff in my food.
That's sketchy, right? Because that's like backed by government for, funding politicians. Like, what is really organic? I don't really always buy that.
Right. And again, people are always doing their best, and I don't want to demonize anyone for being on this journey to figure out like how to do better than they did the time before. And so if that's a stepping stone to transition your land, like, yes, let's do that. Again, so I really think of this as like a yes and approach. We should be maybe moving, especially things that we've really figured out how to grow well in these vertical farms. We should take them off the land, maybe grow them in a vertical farm, and then start restoring that land so that we can do something different with it. And we can still we can come back and grow food on it in a pretty short amount of time. I mean, it's really remarkable how quickly we can restore these systems given all of the data and knowledge that we have now about how soil systems work. So that's really encouraging to me. I think with that in mind, we can definitely supply the world food, and we can provide them better food. And so regeneratively grown food has greater nutrient density, which means in theory, like, you wouldn't have to grow as much food to feed the same amount of people.
Why do you think there's so much pushback on it, or people aren't quite as open-minded to it? Is there not enough money in that way of farming and raising animals? Like, how come there's such a big gap?
Yeah, I think it's scary to people. Change is scary to people, and there are systems in place that incentivize you to grow conventionally. There are also incentives now to grow organically, but neither one of those are regenerative. And so there's just yet to be the kind of social, economic, and political movement to really incentivize regenerative. And I'm expecting that to change over the course of my career, which I'm excited about. But for now, and think about it, like, you have these big ag companies that provide all of these fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and things, and they're huge companies, and they have a lot of power because of their size and their wealth to lobby and make sure that those policies that are supporting their industry stay in effect. And so that's the big hill to climb. So there's an organization called Kiss the Ground. That's a nonprofit out of California, and they're doing a lot of work in this space.
Did they make a documentary?
Yes.
Oh, I haven't. Yeah. I've heard a lot of people mention that. I need to watch it. Is it on Netflix? or Prime?
I actually don't know. It might be Netflix. I'm
There's
not
so
sure where it
many
is.
like streaming services now.
Yeah, I can't keep track.
Do you pay more now on streaming services than you did before you were just buying cable?
Honestly, I never bought cable
Oh,
because like my age range was just like I left my parents' house where they had cable, and then I just like didn't have anything for a while.
How old are you?
I'm 31.
31?
Yeah.
Okay, we're about the same age. I'm
Yeah.
34.
Yeah.
I had cable, and we made the transition to like Netflix, and then it became Amazon Prime, and then we had kids, so then it became Disney Plus, and it's like we're paying more. We must just go back to cable.
I know, like I also kind of bum off.
You're one of those people.
Yeah, that's the thing is like I'll bum off my dad or friends. We share accounts with friends, and so it's just like it's kind of a quagmire. But
that's the way to go, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so teach me about soil. What are the benefits? What do people not know? Because you look at soil.
Yeah.
Before I learned anything,
and
I don't know anything, but before I started diving into it, I was like, it's just dirt.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's the basis I think of the most Americans think about. So what does it all do?
Yeah. Okay. I wrote a list of the ecosystem
I love
services.
The list. Yes. I love the list.
Because I don't want to leave any off because it's really important. I'm going to start with the ones that are most relevant to cities because I suspect that's where a lot of us have been interacting with soils, and so it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. If you're not like on a farm or growing food, you might not be thinking about it. So these are things that as you're walking around in your urban environments or suburban environments, you can think about the services that healthy soil systems provide. Okay. So when we disturb these systems, they might not provide these services. But again, with the water absorption and filtration, can't emphasize that enough, especially in places where we're experiencing so much drought. That is a huge one, which water absorption and filtration contributes to drought tolerance and flood mitigation.
I was going to ask you, I don't want to throw you off too much.
Yeah.
But with all this growth, especially in Dripping Springs, I've noticed like during heavy rains, the city, it's flooding everywhere now. Mm-hmm. Is that a reason? Because we're paving everything now. Everything has buildings, parking lots, and places that used to not flood are just flooding now.
Yes.
And this is what you're talking about.
And we have flash flooding here too in Austin, and it's a combination of the amount of impervious surfaces like you're talking about, and the soil that we do have doesn't have the structure to absorb water so quickly. Here in Texas, we get these huge storms. It's like when it rains, it pours, it just dumps a bunch of water at one time. And so we really need better structured soils to absorb that rate of rain.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise it runs off, and that's when you get all of the flooding.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. And then that makes our water supply really dirty. And so, if it was soaking into the soil, it would be cleaning the water and then slowly distributing it to aquifers and rivers and those kinds of things.
You're making me smarter, Andie.
Good. I'm so glad. You're already like a leg up on most people, so this is awesome. So fire mitigation, I mentioned that earlier. All of those last three ones, drought, flood, and fire, are related to the water component. So soil, good, healthy, structured soil, absorbing water, retaining water, will slow the effects of drought, flood, or fire.
Again, on the fires.
Yeah. And
we'll go through all your list, but I kind of inferred from one of your articles that like natural fires are good sometimes. Can you expand on that? Because I wasn't fully understanding that.
Yeah. So fire, again, thinking from like as an ecologist, fire is considered a disturbance. Tilling is considered a disturbance, right? So you're kind of like, well, fire sounds bad. Fire can be bad, and it's really bad on already disturbed land, which is a lot of our land where we're experiencing fires. So when I say already disturbed, it's like if a fire actually we did have a fire pretty close by here. When you leave, it's in the median. There's like a fire. And so, in a landscape like this that doesn't have a lot of soil structure or water absorption, and a fire starts, it can start going really quickly. Whereas a fire could start in a really mature landscape that has good water retention and good organic matter, and that's going to be a slower burn. And so in some ways it can be beneficial because it's going to keep that landscape in the current ecological succession that it is. So going back to the prairie, a prairie naturally, if it was undisturbed, would just become kind of a thicket and then eventually a forest and eventually like a conifer forest. That's like, in theory, the culmination of ecological succession is becoming a conifer forest.
What is, can you say that word again?
Conifer.
Conifer?
Yeah,
Okay.
conifer. So that's like, around here we have deciduous trees that drop their leaves.
Okay.
Conifer forests are really large trees that are like evergreen, and so they have a lot of biomass themselves, but they're also feeding a lot of carbon and sugars below ground, and so they have a really vibrant soil ecosystem too. So think of that beautiful image as like the pinnacle of ecological succession. And then, but a prairie, which is mostly grasses, and forbs, which are small plants, they're in a lower succession. And so when a fire comes through, it's actually kind of disrupting the ecosystem enough where it's going to burn down a lot of that thickety stuff that was naturally starting to seed. And it'll maintain a prairie environment, which in back pre-colonial times was really beneficial because it was such a useful landscape for bison hunting and like other kind of hunting related means of living.
Okay. No, I did not know that. So thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. Okay, wait. So that was on fire mitigation.
That was fire.
Okay. So heat reduction in city centers is a huge one. So if you have healthy soil providing, which means it's supporting vegetation, you're going to have that cooling effect in an urban environment. Which I'm sure you're familiar with how like urban sites get really hot.
Yeah, like the city of Houston is freaking, it's crazy out there.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have carbon sequestration, which we can dig into a little bit more. That's more of like a global good. Yeah. Anything we can do to have carbon going in the opposite direction than it currently is. Recreation and landscape. So any kind of like fields that you're gonna play soccer on, baseball. Landscapes that you enjoy, like parks or a garden, like a local garden, those are all supported by soil systems. And air quality is one that we don't think about very often. So I mentioned that for two main reasons. One, if you have healthy soil supporting vegetation, that's providing clean oxygen to our local environments, which is important. And then number two, if you have healthy soil systems, they're not subject to erosion, especially wind erosion, which kicks up a lot of particulate matter. And so around here, we see a lot of like hazy days. We're kind of up on a hill and you can just see like this haze. And a lot of that's just particulate matter of like the fields around this region, the soil being wafted into the air and settling over the cities and stuff.
So that means like we're losing soil then?
Oh, yes, at a pretty good rate.
So how do we? You can't make more soil. So, so what happens?
Yeah. So you can technically make more soil because of regeneration practices. So that's important to know. But yeah, I mean, for the longest time, we thought you would need to wait on a geological timescales for soils to be generated through weathering rock and things. That's not necessarily the case now that we know how to use biology to create new soil. But the biggest thing you can do to minimize this air pollution is not tilling your fields.
Oh gosh, but that's like the most common thing. Like every year, I was telling my little brother on the way here, like tilling the field. Like my dad does that.
Yes,
and it's like every one of my family members do that. And that's the way they learn to farm and crop and all that good stuff.
And I want to take a moment to talk about like why people till, because it makes total sense. When you till, you're breaking up any kind of compaction layer. You're creating like furrows where you're going to put the seed, and you're killing any kind of weeds. So you give your crop a leg up on on a chance to grow before the weeds come back. What else are you doing? You're basically trying to prepare the land to. Oh, the biggest one that like people don't think about is that there are studies that show tilling provides a nutrient boost to new seedlings. And my understanding is that is true. And the reason, though, is because when you till, you're breaking up all that fungi and all those organisms I was talking about, and killing them, and then they're being digested by the bacteria. And so what you're really doing is creating like a bacterial bloom. Like, we're more familiar visually with a bacterial bloom in like the Gulf, right?
Yeah.
The same thing's kind of happening on our land, but we can't see it. When we till, we're creating this bloom of bacteria, and so we're actually releasing carbon, because bacteria respire, so they do release CO2, and so that means we're losing some fertility when we do that. But they're also unpacking nutrients that were in those organisms, which does give a little nutrient boost to these seedlings. And so you gotta understand, like, tilling made sense, and it still makes sense to a lot of people. But the more you know about how that disturbance kind of keeps you in this state where you're chained to all these inputs that are costly and they're getting more expensive. So that's the big thing right now that's like starting to have people shift and look for alternative options. Regenerative methods being one of them. Is, I can't afford this nitrogen anymore.
Yeah.
I can't afford. One guy told me he's spending like $300 an acre to grow corn in Kansas. And if he could go biological, it'd be $15 an acre.
Holy crap.
So, like, it's kind of going to be a no-brainer at some point. But yeah, people are scared, and I get that.
There's a pesticide or herbicide that my family is all getting into, that you just spray it. You spray the land one time, and it keeps the weeds down for like 6-7 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that people are doing stuff like that, walk me through the process. Like, have you ever worked with a rancher or a farmer that did this traditional way of farming, and then you taught them and they saw the benefits from the other way? Have you worked with one personally?
Yeah, so I've only been doing this soil service for like a year and a half now. So
Okay.
It's like kind of, I haven't had anyone go from like start to finish through that narrative.
Okay.
I'm very excited to have.
Yeah, I want to take you to my family out there in West Texas.
Heck yeah, in West Texas.
Yeah.
What do they grow?
So it's basically for hunting land. They grow like what do they grow out there, like oats and stuff like that. But it's basically for hunting. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you're asking me about the process, right? Like, what do you do, or what have I done? Maybe let me provide some context so people know like what I actually do day to day. I have a microscope behind me here, and I mostly receive soil samples, or samples of people's amendments, which are usually compost or like a compost tea. And I give them insight into what's living in there or not living in there, and then provide some guidance on what you can do to improve the microbiome of the soil.
Okay.
And so what I hope to do is be able to provide an amendment to somebody as like a stopgap until they can provide their own amendment for themselves. Because the thing is, like, most of these farms and ranches, they have the resources to make their own great amendments, like their inoculation amendments to raise these microbes. But it takes a little time, right? So maybe 3 or 4 months would be like a quick compost option, but there's some methods that can take a year or so. So I would love to have an option. I'm working on my side yard on like making amendments right now and looking at them under the microscope to get to a place where if somebody has a specific landscape and they want to start transitioning their field, depending on what they're growing, they're going to need a different kind of amendment. So if you're growing trees, that's going to be a different amendment than if you're growing tomatoes.
Okay. And how do you make these amendments?
It's composting, but it's like really strategic composting. So when you think compost, you might think of like a backyard compost where you're throwing food scraps and
like
stuff.
Bananas and apples and stuff like that.
Yeah, which is great, but that's not what I'm doing.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is really procuring specific amounts of material. Like I really know the quantity that I'm doing. And I also know I have some amount of insight into what's called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so that informs how the pile heats up, which is important because it's going to kill any pathogens that happen to be in the pile. It kills weed seeds. And then the great like relief of the piles when it's cooling down, and that's when like the beneficial stuff is given a chance to grow. And that's the general process. And so there's many methods out there, but that's the one that I'm trying right now. Is that's called thermophilic composting. Okay. Yeah, which is
so awesome, Andie.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
so are you self-employed? Do you work
yes.
with the okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I work for Rhizos LLC. I wore my shirt today.
Represent.
Yeah. So that's
awesome.
That's my business. And right now all I do is offer microscopy services and some amount of consulting, but I'm in a program to become a certified consultant. So I really have to prove that I can turn a dirt into a living soil, like an actual disturbed ecosystem into a healed regenerative landscape. And so and the program I'm doing that with is Dr. Elaine Ingham. I consider her like the mother of soil biology.
I'm about to say that name sounds really familiar.
Yeah, she's been in the game. Has like 4 decades worth of research under her belt and is now sharing her knowledge to a more global audience. So instead of just remaining in the university system and within the limitations of academia, she's taken her content and her knowledge online and is now teaching people like me who are really interested in this but don't necessarily want to go get a PhD and do research. I want to actually practically help people.
Right.
And so she and a whole slew of mentors are doing this work. So and anyone can do it. Like a lot of the people in the program have transitioned their careers. So that maybe they had a career in tech for 10 to 15 years and they were looking to switch it up. They learned about soil, got interested, and now this is like a really good pathway to get up to speed on what you need to know to really practically help any kind of land steward.
You're motivating me.
Yeah. You're going to
switch it up.
Podcasting.
Yeah, switch it up, man. Get out of the chemical industry. Yeah. All right. So what else is on the list?
Okay. So those are the top ones that come to mind when I think of cities, but some other important ones worth mentioning. Obviously, food. Healthy soil contributes to food production, fiber production. So we don't think about that very often, but all of our cotton clothes or wool, a lot of our fibers are coming from soil systems. Our building materials too. So whether that's bricks, mortar, or wood like lumber, that's coming from a soil system. Medicine is one that we don't think of often, but a lot of our antibiotics and things that have helped us throughout history have been isolated from microbes that were discovered in soil systems. Wow. And additionally, think herbalism and plants. Like we've also got a fair amount of medicine coming from plants, which come from soil. And decomposition is a huge one. So can you imagine a world where nothing decomposed?
Yeah.
Just
that's crazy. That's
crazy,
right? That's what scares me. That's what there's a lot of people on YouTube that are saying we're heading that way.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. Like somebody was asking me the other day, why do some farmers burn their fields? And I was like, it's kind of like they do it for all the reasons you would do tilling, like get rid of the weeds, and in some ways it's generating some nutrients in the same fashion as tilling. One benefit of burning instead of tilling is that you're not creating compaction. So the tiller is disrupting compaction that's at the top, but it's creating compaction below. And plant roots know no bounds, so they could be growing deeper, but a lot of times you end up with this hard pan where the tiller had been scraping by. But burning is primarily used to burn off all the plant residue that wasn't breaking down in the field. And the reason it's not breaking down is because there's no soil biology there. It's just it's just a bunch of dirt, and
it's just like a dead landscape, basically.
It's a dead landscape, and that's why I call it a substrate. And that's a sciencey term, but a substrate is just something that something living grows on. It's just a substrate that's supposed to be sterile. And when we do that, we're putting the onus on us to figure out what to feed a plant, and that's a huge responsibility.
I still keep going back to, and I don't mean to keep harping on it, but I keep going back to how the new farmers and new ranchers like Taylor, I think are a lot more receptive to this new information, regenerative lifestyle. But the ranchers that have been in that field for generations on generations, I don't. It's like I feel like it's like a no-win situation almost, like trying to convince them of this new method.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't.
It's more like a human psychology
Yeah.
issue than anything else. And I think about it that way. In fact, there's a world-renowned consultant named Nicole Masters, and she wrote a book called, oh shoot, Andie, don't forget the name of the most epic soil book. I'm totally gonna forget it. It'll come to me. It might be For the Love of Soil. And
You got your phone? You can do a quick Google search.
Oh my gosh, I was gonna say if it's up on my shelf.
What? Him and my phone.
I think it's For the Love of Soil.
For the Love of Soil.
Yeah.
Who's it by?
Nicole Masters.
I'll say do a quick Google search. That way
we gotta fact check this, because if I get this wrong,
we need a Jamie, dude. You're supposed to be the Jamie. Let's see. For the Love of Soil.
Yes. See if that's Nicole Masters.
Of Soil. Yep, Nicole Masters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna add that book to my shelf now.
Yeah, please do. Honestly, it's a little dense for like the uninitiated. Like there's better books for like entering into this.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I'm gonna mention one real quick before getting back to my point on Nicole Masters. I think the best book that really pieces this together for how soil health is connected to human health is a book by David Montgomery and his wife Anne Bilk, I think is how you pronounce her last name. And they've written several books together. They're all fantastic, but this one is called Hidden Half of Nature.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that one's on my shelf.
Got it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool.
It's like I'm gonna make sure.
I'm gonna read all these books.
Excellent. So that one, it's like the first half is all about how soil systems work, and it's really fascinating. And then the second half, Anne writes through a personal experience of getting diagnosed with cancer and then like transforming her diet and like healing herself. And it's a journey of gardening. So I just love that there's this really personal account, but they're both scientists, and so they have this approach of, they're just great communicators. They know the subject matter so deeply, and then they have this ability to communicate it. And on top of that, they have this personal experience. So there's like a narrative. It's really powerful, the hidden half of nature.
I love how you said that, transforming the thoughts and, the farmer's culture, I guess, is like a psychology problem. Because I told you I work at Dow and I implement digital projects, and it's like a lot of change. And I always joke around and say like, I'm not like a project manager.
Yeah.
I'm more of like a psychologist or therapist, because I'm trying to like convince people. And I feel like that you're doing something very similar here. You're helping these farmers and opening up new ideas and sharing all this information. So it's very beautiful. Yeah.
And Nicole Masters, I felt like I've been thinking that way for so long. And then when I started reading her book, I was like, oh my gosh, like she gets it. Of course she gets it. She's Nicole Masters, but she really emphasizes culture and behavior, I think is the word that she uses. Like behavior is the biggest factor of whether or not someone's going to succeed in taking on regenerative methods or not, because if they don't really believe in it or they get scared and they deviate from the plan, which is really common, then they just keep setting themselves back. And so you really got to commit, and you really got to understand how it's working so that you have faith and trust in that it's going to work out. And that's the biggest piece, I think. The most difficult part, like doing the actual land stewardship, is kind of the easy part when you consider how challenging it can be to change your behavior and the way you think.
Is that the new term that like regenerative farmers are using? I noticed Taylor Collins, he calls himself a land steward. Is that like the new term for it?
Yeah, I feel like, kind of going back to my title or whatever, I do feel like land steward is a really appropriate term for somebody who's farming regeneratively, because they're nurturing the land, they're stewarding the land, they're really letting the land lead the way, like inform them of how to help the land in turn, right? So it's a relationship based approach to cultivation instead of a land management, which I think would be like there's plenty of land managers out there,
Right.
but land steward, just the terminology, like our words matter, I think.
Yeah.
If how you regard yourself, whether you're are you managing the land or are you stewarding the land, there's a difference.
No,
Yeah.
that's very thoughtful. I didn't even think about it that way, but I even on his Instagram lives, he introduces himself as a land steward, and I should have asked him that when I was talking to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else?
What else? Okay. I think that was mostly it on the ecosystem services. So I don't think I have much else for you on that. I did have some notes on soil fertility if you wanted to
Yes.
kind of get in.
That was one of my favorite articles that you wrote. Yeah.
Cool.
So what is, because I tried to explain to him what soil fertility was and I butchered the hell out of it. So
well, I'm going to use the Food and Agriculture Organization definition. Normally I like making up my own definitions for things, but I think they did this one pretty good. So they say that soil fertility is the ability of a soil to sustain plant growth by providing essential plant nutrients and favorable chemical, physical, biological characteristics as a habitat for plant growth. So that's a lot of words, but the things I want to point out is that they cover all our bases in terms of chemical, physical, and biological characteristics. I appreciate that because some sources might focus just on physical. Physical is like your mineral content, your sand, silt, and clay. It's chemical and physical. There's like a geochemistry aspect where like the ions and the energy in the soil, which is like a whole wealth of mystery to me, but like a lot of people are studying that. Those sometimes people focus on like one or the other, and a lot of times biology is like just left out entirely. And so now more and more I'm seeing that that biological characteristic is being incorporated into these definitions, and I really think that's a testament to this shift that's happening in our like collective understanding of soil as a habitat. And so they focus on the interaction between soil and plants a lot. So like fertility is all about like, can this soil support plant life?
Because if it can support plant life, that means it can support the animals, right? Is that like the main
it's
thought?
like the starting point of begetting other life forms.
Okay.
Yeah.
So soil fertility, that's basically what we've been talking about, right? If a land is not healthy and you're tilling it and you're not able to grow anything, the soil fertility is real low. Like, how do you measure it? Like, what's the rating scale of that?
Right. So a lot of times when people get a traditional soil test, they're looking at their NPK, their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, along with a lot of your micronutrients like calcium and magnesium. And those are all good things to look at. But fertility is so much more. So a lot of times those tests are showing you what's immediately plant available. And that's just such a fraction of the story of your soil health. And so by that, I mean, like, there's a lot of nutrients in a biologically based soil, like a thriving soil, that is technically tied up, or like it won't register on a test like that as like a plant available nitrate, but there's nitrogen in the system, in the ecosystem, and it's being cycled. And so like that's one remarkable difference between a soil with thriving biology, is that you have a lot of nutrients available to the plants as long as they're in relationship with the microorganisms. But we've kind of trained ourselves to think about, like, does the plant have what it needs like right now? And that means we start pouring on like synthetic fertilizers because it looks like our nitrogen's low. And in the case of a disturbed ecosystem, like it probably is, but in a regenerative state, just because you have low nitrates doesn't mean that you're deficient in nitrogen necessarily.
Oh, so someone could potentially go to a regenerative farm or land and try to poke holes through it because it doesn't rate as high as some other place that's using herbicides and pesticides.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And in some cases, it's like, I think a better test to compare the difference between those two kind of environments would be something more like a leaf analysis. Like, what's the plant health like? Because we're kind of misinterpreting the soil health based on those numbers. But if you can look at a leaf analysis and see how much more dynamic the leaf contents are of a regeneratively raised crop compared to one that's conventionally raised, that can be really telling. And I've seen this time and time again. Like Brix Levels is a useful tool. Brix basically is like a measurement of sugars. And a lot of times people just do that in fruit because, and when I say fruit, I also mean things like tomatoes and squash and whatever else. But they focus on the fruit of the plant to use Brix as like an indicator of quality. So like how much flavor does this have? And when I was working in controlled ag spaces, I remember asking some growers like, well, do you ever test the leaves? And they're like, why would we test the leaves? And I'm like, well, because the sugars have leaves too. And so the regenerative understanding is you'll have Brix is basically associated with higher levels of nutrients in general. It's just correlated. It's not like a hard rule. But if you have a higher sugar content in the leaves, you likely have more energy to produce things that are going to fend off pests and fend off pathogens and produce just a more nutrient dense product.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of information, Andie.
I know. I'm sorry. I kind of went there.
No, but it's awesome.
Yeah.
Like I'm really obsessed with this.
Good.
Can we get into like very high level how the soil protects the environment? Like your article on carbon sequestration. How do you say the word?
Yeah, sequestration.
Okay, I feel like I'm gonna butcher it every time.
Yeah, you're good.
I kind of got lost there a little bit. Can you dumb it down for me?
Okay. Yeah, that's good
else?
feedback.
Yeah. Well, no. I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
So it's.
No, I want to make sure that this is really clear because this is like one of the most fundamental issues of our time. So if people don't understand how carbon or how soil fits into the carbon cycle, that's a huge problem. So let's get clear on it.
Yeah.
Keep me honest. If I lose you somewhere, chime in. I know you will. So the basic mechanism of how carbon gets into soil is through photosynthesis. So again, if you see a bare field, there's no photosynthesis happening. So there's no carbon like going into that soil.
A bare field meaning just like no grass, no plants?
Yeah, just nothing, like a tilled field.
Okay.
Yeah, if there's grass, like there's photosynthesis happening for sure. Or even if like out our back door where there's like, where they've excavated, like definitely no, like there's carbon loss. So when photosynthesis happens, we, going back to grade school, like we know that a plant takes in CO2 and sunlight and takes up water through its roots, and then some magic happens and you get plant sugars. What they don't tell you in third grade is a lot of those sugars are released through the roots. Like sometimes it's been recorded up to like 80% of the sugars are actually released through the roots. And that's really surprising to people because it's like, well, why would a plant do that? Doesn't it want to just use those sugars for its own makeup, its leaves and its fruit and its roots? And the answer is because they're feeding the microbial ecosystem below ground. So they're actually exuding sugars and other compounds to attract the beneficial microbes that they evolved over millennia with to keep them nice and close to their roots because they provide this symbiotic relationship. So it's a transaction. I'll give you these sugars that you like so much if you give me phosphorus that I need.
Okay.
That's the basic principle. And so carbon's journey, I'm going to take it one step further and you tell me if we've gone too far. But that basically is just like the sugars are coming out of the plant, but it doesn't just like sit in the soil. A microbe will come along and consume it. And then that microbe's like embodying that carbon. So it becomes part of its makeup.
Right.
And I think where I might start losing people is when we go back to something I said earlier, which is respiration. Like bacteria respire like we do, so do fungi. So that means they do release CO2. So the question is like, well, what the heck? Like, how does the carbon stay in the soil? And it's really a matter of ratios. Okay, so let's say you have of all of the sugars that the plant is putting into the soil, when a bacteria comes along, it will respire up to like 80% of that carbon. So it's only retaining about 20%, but that's still a net gain into the soil. You're still keeping some carbon into the soil. A fungi, on the other hand, is like the opposite. It blows off roughly 20% of carbon, but it retains 80%. And when you think about, because it's a more carbon-based organism. And when I say fungi, I'm not talking about mushrooms. I'm talking about like the mycelium in the soil. That's actually the body of fungi is beneath the surface where we can't see it. It's like these long filaments. And so the surface area on those is important because it's kind of like, when they give you a stat of like, if you stretched this, I'm going to use mycelium as an example, but they do this with other things that have high surface area.
Like veins or something in your body.
Veins. Yeah. If like, that's a great example, like capillaries and stuff in your body. It's like, it'd stretch a mile long.
Right.
That's what high surface area does is like, it's actually a lot of material, but it can be fit into a small space. And so fungi is the same way where like its amount of carbon that it can contain is really significant. And again, if we disturb that ecosystem, what did I say gets died, like kills off first?
Yep.
It's the fungi. And so that's why we actually lose a lot of carbon from our agricultural lands because of all the disturbance. So we're doing like the opposite of the thing that soil is supposed to be providing, which is carbon sequestration. So I'm going to stop there and check in, like, how are we doing on that?
That makes sense. So carbon helps keep, I'm trying to play this in and refer back to your article, but when we disturb the land, carbon gets released, and then that's basically like heat emits off the carbon. Is that?
Oh yeah. Okay. So let's talk about like why carbon in the atmosphere is just not a good thing.
Okay.
So the actual shape of a CO2 molecule, I'll just kind of draw it for you real quick. You got like, imagine almost like a triangle. So this is the carbon, and then you have 2 oxygen coming off of it. Does the camera need to see that?
Yeah, you can point it at the camera. Do a little carbon action.
CO2. So what's happening there is the actual shape of that molecule when it's in our atmosphere reflects heat back down to us. So let's back up real quick. We gain heat to our planet from the sun. Okay. Right. So the sun is radiating light. The light is what the energy is, and then once it hits the surfaces of Earth, some of that's absorbed, but then some of it's like at capacity, and then it's radiated back. So there's almost like this reflection of radiant heat, but then it interacts with things like CO2 and methane, and that's gonna keep like trap the heat. So it's not if the CO2 and stuff wasn't there, or other greenhouse gases, then it would just escape into space. The radiant heat would escape into space, and that's essentially what happens during like ice ages and stuff. Is like our atmosphere isn't able to retain heat well enough, so there's a lot of heat escaping, and then we go into like an ice age. So we do need a certain amount of CO2 to maintain the environment that is good for humans and so much other life. But when you overdo it, when you have too much CO2, and then we're just like baking ourselves in this greenhouse.
Okay. So that's why disturbing the land is putting more carbon into the atmosphere, which is essentially making it hotter. So when it's talking about global warming, that's basically what it means. Yes.
And I do want to point out that like conventional agriculture methods are a contributing factor to CO2 release, but the biggest one is going to be burning of fossil fuels. So, fossil fuels come from deep within like a soil system typically, and those are old plants and animals and stuff that have died and decomposed, and so they're carbon-based animals. That's right. And then they're basically fossilized, but into a form that now we found can generate energy. And so, but every time we burn that carbon, we're now releasing it into the atmosphere. And so there's those, I would say, are like 2 major ways carbon gets into the atmosphere. Some people, it's kind of a myth that like our population is too big. I wouldn't go around like feeling guilty about exhaling.
Like hold your breath.
Yeah, like that's going way too far. But because like the amount that we've burned is like way more. It's kind of like before anthropogenic sources of carbon, whether it was coming from agriculture or fossil fuels, would have been like volcanoes, like things that took all of that matter like deep within the earth and like released it into the Earth's atmosphere. And so I think it's kind of fun to think about, like, when you see a car go by, just like imagining like a little volcano like in the back of like every truck or in the seat of every car that you see, because that's basically what we're doing. We just have all these tiny little volcanoes going off like every second of every day.
Does the carbon that gets released from the earth, does it ever get put back in the earth? Like, how is there a cycle that can be done to put it back in?
Yeah, so the two major sinks are going to be soil and the ocean. And technically the ocean, like that, they're both part of the carbon cycle. Like carbon will go into those systems and maybe exist there for a little bit and maybe be released, So I always say, like, it's not that we're just trying to get carbon in and that it's going to stay there. It's kind of like we just want the soil to be a popular stop in the cycle, because then that means that we're generating more and more carbon like in the soil. So one thing real quick about oceans is, like, technically it's a bigger sink. Like, there's more of our planet that's water than land. But the implications of CO2 increasing in an ocean atmosphere or an ocean environment is detrimental from what we know. Like, there's actually a lot that's unknown, like how much CO2 can the ocean handle without having like a mass extinction?
Because it heats up the water?
It's more of like a pH issue, and then also the heating of the environment causing like the icebergs and glaciers to melt is a huge problem that we're already seeing in the sea level rise. But it's more of like a pH issue that people are concerned about, as like ocean acidification, and how, like, the implications that's going to have on ocean life. And so what's really cool is, like, we know that the increase of carbon in our soils is a really good thing. And so it's a bad thing. It could potentially be this really bad thing for oceans, or we're not really sure, but we do know that, like, to increase carbon in the soil sphere is a really beneficial thing for us.
So some quick things that can be done, I say quick things, but some smart things that can be done to speed up the process of soil coming from the atmosphere into the soil is regenerative farming. I mean, what are some other things?
Keeping your soil covered. So whether that's through vegetation of some kind, like, your turf is actually better than gravel. So I might irritate some people saying that, because they might think that they're doing the right thing by having like a xeriscaping. And I'm not saying you're doing the wrong thing necessarily. There's like all sorts of different contexts, but that might just be a practical thing to mention, is that, like, if you're tempted to take out your turf and put in a bunch of gravel, just consider that, like, you're kind of sterilizing that environment. Even if you put some plants in, it's just not as vegetated.
Is that soil sealant, or what is it called? Soil seal?
Oh, soil sealing.
Is that what that is when you do that?
Yeah, because it's an impervious surface. Rocks, yeah, in theory, they're going to break down over time and mineralize, but not like mulch. Okay, so mulch is a way better way to make a path on your property. And yeah, you're going to have to top it off every now and then, because it's freaking degrading, which is like what we want. So when you're mulching your trees, or you're like, slugging out all these bags and stuff, like, that's actually a really beautiful thing that you're having to top off, because, like, my husband asked me, he's like, so where does the mulch go? I was like, yeah, it's like degrading. Isn't that cool? Like, he's like, I just don't understand. Like, it was just there. And I'm like, yeah, I know. It's like feeding the ground, feeding all those organisms we're talking about. So mulch is a great way in times where, like, your plants maybe are dormant. Cover crops are another really great tool. And they're not just for farms. Like, I'm thinking about using a cover crop in areas where grass doesn't grow very well, in like shady parts of our yard.
Right.
So yeah, keeping the soil covered in one way or another is like one of the most important things you can do as a citizen of the world, even if you're not a land steward per se.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, Andie, we're reaching time. I know you have a busy schedule, but what's some like lasting advice that you would give people? Like, what can they do if, not everyone's a rancher, a lot of people live in cities. What can people do to make an impact and positively, protect our soil and just become, I guess, more cognizant of what we're doing?
Yeah. I think getting educated on it. So if this has piqued your interest in any way, like get that book I mentioned, Hidden Half of Nature, like just start somewhere in understanding it for yourself and like the implications that soil health has on you. So I'd say reading. Secondly, I would say consider your food sources, like really investigate that, because there's one institute that I'll point you to called Bionutrient Institute, and this is a really cool idea. I think you're going to like this. So they're working on technology to basically take with you to the grocery store to like detect one fruit's nutrient density compared to another's.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And so like I'm imagining this being like part of our phone someday.
Yeah.
You know, that we just take with us everywhere.
Holy crap.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would put the power in the consumer's hands to transform the way we grow food, because right now there's just not enough demand, because there's not enough awareness of like those discrepancies, like the different, like you see this price tag, that's all you have to go on. And if you're like, I really don't want to pay $6 for that organic option or regenerative option compared to this $2 conventional option. So, but if you had the data right there in your hand and we're like, oh, well, 5 of these peaches equal 1 of those, like from a nutrient perspective, that might change your mind about your purchasing decision, which will in turn change the industry and how people are growing food.
Yeah.
So yeah, books, get curious about your food. And lastly, if you can, like maybe find someone with a microscope, maybe look at some footage, like just get a little bit awe-inspired by what's happening in the soil. And next time you look out across your lawn or you're on a walk or something, just hold space for like the biology that's serving us, even in disturbed landscapes. Like it's there. And the things that you can do as a homeowner, or if you have a yard, especially, like you can just make better decisions on what you're distributing on your lawn. So look for things like Microlife is a really great brand here, local to Texas in the Houston area. Things that are actually biology based. And so I will warn against compost, because like a lot of compost, quote unquote, is not really that beneficial if they come from like really large scale producers.
Yeah.
They're doing a service by making sure that waste doesn't go to a landfill, but they're not necessarily being aware of all of the biology that they could be producing to restore a landscape. So what you really end up with is a lot of bacteria, and our disturbed landscapes already have enough bacteria and they need fungi. So anything you can find with like fungi is going to help your turf or your trees or just about anything at this point.
God, see, I never even thought. So I thought fungi was like bad for your grass and your trees and all that.
No. Yeah, I mean there are bad varieties. There's bad species, but that's the connotation we have, is like some people when they see a mushroom they like get freaked out in their yard, and I see a mushroom and I delight in it. And it's not to say that like so mushrooms belong to a family called Basidiomycetes, and about 90% of them are good guys.
Oh, so if you see that in your yard, then it's a good thing.
Yeah, odds are like it's a good thing. It's serving your landscape. And molds and mildews are more the things that we're concerned about. Okay. And on the microscope, what's really interesting is they look really different than your run-of-the-mill fungi. So that's helpful to me, because it's like if I have a concern about a fungal issue, I just put it on the microscope and I can know right away, like, is this something to be concerned about or not? But yeah, fungi is like a huge one that we actually need more of. And when you keep in mind, like when you disturb ecosystems, it actually makes way for pathogens to crop up. So pathogens, whether it's bacterial or fungal, they exist in almost every ecosystem, but when you have a lot of beneficial activity, they're out competing, they're consuming, they're taking up real estate on plant roots. The beneficial ones are going to outcompete your bad guys and keep things in balance.
It's amazing. Yeah. A lot of information, but really good information.
Yeah.
How can people follow you? Do you have a website? I know you got your Substack, but how else can people engage with you?
Yeah, so my website is rhizos.science. So rhizo, I don't think I said earlier, is actually the root word for root. And so I just pluralized it. Rhizos.science, RHIZOS is my website. And then I also create content, as you said, on my Substack. That's, I guess, rhizos.substack.com. And lastly, Instagram, which is at Soil is Sexy.
Awesome. That's a good freaking name right there.
Yeah. Snagged it early.
Well, I appreciate it, Andie. It was amazing. And I'm glad Taylor. How did you link up with Taylor real quick?
Taylor, I think the way we linked up is that he was like an early follower of my newsletter back when I didn't know what I was doing, like a few years ago. And he would even email me and just be like, I love this one, just really good energy. And so he was encouraging from the get. And I knew about Rome Ranch and I knew about Epic and stuff. And so once I saw him in my inbox, I was like, that's cool. That's cool that somebody locally is even reaching out, because you just never know when you get on a platform like Instagram and then start writing newsletters for those followers who's gonna find you. But he found it, and so he's just been following some of my content and reached out.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
he's a great dude.
Yeah,
I'm glad he linked us up. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing because it's very important. So I appreciate your time, Andie.
I appreciate that too. Thank you.
All right, I'll talk to you later.